Order, order. On behalf of the committee, can I extend a very warm welcome to our witnesses this morning. We are extremely grateful for you, to you for coming to give evidence to us today. Can I introduce Andrew Opie, Director of Food and Sustainability at the British Retail Consortium, Karen Wheeler, former Director General, Cross-Government Border Delivery Group, HMRC, and I should make it clear that Ms Wheeler is a former HMRC official, having retired in June. Therefore, you're not today speaking on behalf of HMRC, and clearly you've not been privy to confidential government papers since you left the service of the government. And James Hookham, Deputy Chief Executive of the Freight Transport Association. Now, we have a lot, as always, with this committee of ground to cover. As succinct answers as possible would be really helpful, and not all three of you don't have to feel obliged to answer every question. But I wanted to begin with the practicalities, and let's focus on Dover-Calais, because we've read what was in the Operation Yellowhammer report. The day before yesterday, there was another report that was revealed, apparently analysis that had been done for the Department of Transport, again about what might happen on the Dover-Calais Straits. And in both cases, the reports said there would be significant delays, even under the best case, and even longer delays under the worst case. So I would just like to get from each of you, what is your assessment of what is likely to happen? What kind of delay are we going to be looking at from the 1st of November if the UK were to leave without a deal? I don't know who wants to go first. Mr Hookham, do you want to start?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I think our assessment of the Yellowhammer report was that it actually offered a more severe scenario than even we were predicting, based on our understanding of the checks and arrangements that would be in place. I think it's very important, though, in this discussion, as I've said to the committee before, to distinguish between the direction of flows. So inbound imports into the UK are expected to have a relatively smooth ride because of the, shall we say, pragmatic approach that we expect border officials to take to checks, and the arrangements that we understand are in place to move as much enforcement activity away from the border and further inland. The great unknown for my members, be they traders or hauliers, is exactly the position of and the enforcement strategy of French customs officials and other border officials. And it's although there are good arrangements in place in Calais, the port itself has organised itself in such a way to certainly increase its capacity to hold vehicles within the port that may require checks. It's impossible to foretell just how stringent those checks will be, what the intensity of those checks will be, and, if you like, the assumed risk factors that the French border officials assume on British imports as they see them. That, for us, is the single biggest unknown, and will cause determine the overall level of services that are able to run, simply because if ferries or shuttle trains are not able to turn around to discharge their vehicles and return from Calais back to Dover, then obviously the frequency of service drops, the overall capacity across the Dover Straits declines, and that's when you start to get the queues backing up into Kent and the need for Operation BrExit and so on. Had
the government shared with you their thinking that we've seen revealed in the Yellowhammer report?
No, not on all of the details of the report itself. Obviously, we were familiar with many of the aspects that the report talked about.
Were you surprised that they hadn't shared it with you?
I was surprised that perhaps they hadn't thought to share some of the consequences that they had anticipated with the leading voice of logistics in the UK, simply because the biggest surprise in the report for us was a supposed threat to domestic fuel supplies. And clearly that affects all transport operators in the UK, not just those that travel between the UK and the rest of the EU.
Now, as I recall, that's partly to do with the impact of traffic congestion in Kent, which is something that's been warned about before because of the backing up of the lorries that you've described. And then there was also a reference to the impact of the new tariff regime on a couple of refineries.
Yes.
So there were, two elements to that. What percentage of trucks would you anticipate trying to get into France are going to have the right paperwork on the 1st of November?
Oh, goodness. As many of them as we can possibly reach and communicate to, Chair. That's again, another unknown question. We have, as an association, commenced briefing sessions and developed our own briefing material to try to raise, the awareness and B, the detailed knowledge of our members. This is our major focus at the moment. We obviously hope a deal will be struck and would much prefer a deal
Sure.
with a transition period, but accept the stated position of government, and therefore we are committed to reducing the impact of no deal on our members through informing them, training them, auditing them, as well as trying to influence the arrangements to be as
But do you have any
low-friction as
idea of
possible.
what percentage of them are geared up to have the right paperwork?
Not in a way that we can quantify that reliably for the committee.
No. Okay. Right. Ms. Wheeler.
Yes. So I can say something about that up until the end of June because we were working on the assumption, obviously, that the French will impose full customs and other controls on all goods entering the EU through Calais, and that their preparations were good and they looked ready. I'm sure there would be teething problems, but they would be ready. So the key constraint, as you suggest, is about the extent to which the trucks have the right documentation. And as at the end of June, it was still operating on the basis of only 70,000 of the 145,000 businesses had even got as far as getting an EORI number,
Yeah.
which is the easy prerequisite to being able to make customs declarations. So that was less than 50% at that time. We tried to assess what would be the impact of those numbers on the number of trucks going through Dover and Calais. That is very, very difficult. We found it very difficult to quantify, but our assessment at the time was that less than 50% of the trucks would be prepared with the correct documentation. But we found it very difficult to really get into much more specificity than that, based on the numbers and the information that HMRC had available. That in itself, though, if less than 50% were ready and prepared, given there are something like 10,000 trucks a day going through Dover, Calais and Eurotunnel, clearly it would not take very long for the available space at Calais and Eurotunnel to fill up with trucks which the French could not let through. I think we were operating on the basis of something like 300 spaces in Calais and Eurotunnel, and that would be filled up within a couple of ferry loads of trucks. Then it would all rest on how long they sat there waiting, and these customs preparations can't be done within minutes or even hours. So it depends on how long the French hold them there before releasing them into France. We made some assessments about that, but our views were that would cause very significant delays. You'd immediately get queues as trucks can't be released into France, and that would cause thousands of trucks to be held up in Kent. And as James has said, because those trucks are held up in Kent, not able to get across, that would cause impact on imports, which otherwise would not be impacted by UK controls significantly.
Right. Now, when Operation Yellowhammer came out, the government said, oh, well, that's the very worst case scenario. And yet it sounds to me, from what both of you have said already, that even in the best case, there are going to be delays.
Yes.
So do you think that is correct, that Yellowhammer is the worst case? And do you may not be able to reveal, did it also have a most likely or medium scenario along with the worst case?
Well, so Yellowhammer was all based on the reasonable worst case. So, there's an unreasonable worst case, which would be even worse than Yellowhammer.
Right.
So reasonable worst case means it stands a chance, a significant chance of happening, but it is not a likely thing. So if you think about the normal distribution curve, it would be on, it wouldn't be right on the extreme ends, but it would stand a reasonable chance of happening. Though all of these things are judgments, of course.
Sure.
But that's where we were operating, and therefore we thought it was at the less likely end of a reasonable possibility. We tried, so Yellowhammer per se didn't necessarily come up with plans for what is a likely case, because the whole point about Yellowhammer is its contingency for what is the reasonable worst case of what might happen. But in our planning around the border and Dover-Calais, clearly what we were trying to do was also think about, well, if that's the reasonable worst case, what is a more likely case? Is there a best case where there is no delay? And again, while we couldn't be definitive about that, we've, I think, ended up feeling that if it was 40 to 60% of flow rate going through in a reasonable worst case, it might get up to 70, possibly 80% in a best case. But even in those cases, which seems just as unlikely as the reasonable worst case, you would still get delays under those circumstances, because of the 20% of 10,000 trucks a day would still cause Calais and Eurotunnel to clog up, and that would still cause problems going through. But they wouldn't be as extreme, for obvious reason.
So your assessment was, whatever the outcome, there's going to be clogging up and there are going to be delays.
Yes.
And there are going to be problems.
Yes.
Can you just, to help us, where the French customs officials apply the full panoply of checks required, because we'll be a third country from the 1st of November in these circumstances, is it just a question of checking the correct paperwork, for example, in respect of phytosanitary checks, or does it also involve having to open the back of the lorry and look at stuff? And therefore, open the back of the lorry and look at stuff is going to add additional time to the time taken to check the paperwork, assuming you've got the right paperwork in the first place. Is that correct?
Well, so it's certainly true that there is a whole a panoply of requirements for phytosanitary checks. Andrew may well know more detail about precisely those. So for different types of product, some will just be a documentary check. Some will be, yes, we've actually got to check that the food is fresh and safe. Some of those checks can take more time than others, because they may need to test samples, whereas some is probably just a simple test. But the French had built, specially built, facilities for those checks, and had space for holding trucks. So they'd factored that into their assumptions. So provided the correct documentation was there, that was not an additional delay on the delays that I was describing. That was not something that we felt that we needed to factor in as an additional delay.
Fine, that's very helpful. Mr. Oakley.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said, and all the analysis that we've done with our members have been based on the briefings that we've had directly from government, and we've been working directly, particularly with DEFRA, every week since October last year, preparing for a no-deal Brexit. So we feel that our members are pretty well equipped to know what the delays are going to be. Then we can overlay that to the imports that we make at that time of year. And that time of year is a really crucial problem for retailers for two reasons. First of all, we are pretty close to peak imports at that stage, because obviously we've gone out of the UK growing season. We're importing our fresh produce in particular from Europe, and that all needs to come through Calais, and I'm sure we can talk about why fresh produce needs to move so quickly through Calais. The second problem is end of October is the really peak period for retailers in general. Everybody is gearing up for Christmas at that time. So everybody's logistics are already at full stretch. Warehousing space is at an absolute premium at that time. And it's very difficult to flex any extra space in terms of storage, because that's taken up already to account for the additional consumer demand that there's always likely to be at Christmas. So for us, the end of October is probably the worst time to face a no-deal Brexit. And actually for us it might be interesting also to, this is kind of just the immediate problem for food retailers, because of course, as both speakers have already said, the UK is not going to operate checks, but it cannot operate on that system forever. We know from discussions with Food Standards Agency, for example, that things like meat products will need to be certified before they come into the UK, which means they will be checked within 6 months. So then you've got border checks the other side of the channel, our side of the channel, and how we accommodate those, the bureaucracy that goes with it. There's one thing I just wanted to add to the SPS checks. On top of the SPS checks, there is a kind of a slightly added problem, in that you also have to comply with the European regulations in terms of transport of food. So things like heat-treated pallets are necessary to move food across borders, and at the moment this country doesn't have enough heat-treated pallets to move all the food that we actually export from the UK, from GB, and I include our exports into the Republic of Ireland, where many retailers have stores, as well as into Europe. So there's the checks issue going out, but there's also the physical infrastructure for us to be able to move the product as well.
So just on that specific point of the heat-treated pallets, has anything been done to try and increase the availability of those?
We are told that is being increased.
By government?
Yes.
Are they stockpiling them?
No.
So how are they going to increase the supply?
My understanding is they've been talking to the manufacturers.
I think there's been an obvious opportunity for manufacturers to put into the market what are obviously pallets at higher cost, that they require this additional treatment and certification. But I doubt if there has been time to build up sufficient supplies to meet this need. And certainly a lot of my members are telling me that this is they're having great difficulty sourcing these pallets and questioning whether or not this will actually be significant in the early days of a no deal. It's a very, very significant additional burden.
In other words, the problem is if French customs officials say, well, everything else is fine, but I'm terribly sorry, your pallets haven't been heat treated, so you're not coming in. And you'll only have enough if the people who are moving the stuff have got the pallets to put the food on at the moment it's required. Well, that's the point that we can pursue. Just one other question from me, and then I'll bring other colleagues in. On Sunday, Michael Gove told Andrew Marr, and I quote, "There will be no shortages of fresh food." And as I understand it, the British Retail Consortium issued a statement after Mr Gove comments, which began, "It is categorically untrue that the supply of fresh food will be unaffected under a no-deal Brexit." Could you explain to us why what was said isn't the case?
Well, our assessment is based on discussions with our members who move fresh produce every day into the UK. So these are the people that sell food to us every day. And the disruption that we've just been talking about, the likely disruption, we've modelled that with our members who have made it clear to us that there will be disruption to fresh food, and I'm sure we can talk about categories of fresh food which are going to be more likely to be affected by that. It will affect fresh food in various ways. availability, shelf life, and potentially cost pressure on fresh food in particular. And we've shared that information very, very widely over the period with...
Including the government?
Including the government and every MP. In fact, we wrote to every MP back in January when we were facing a March BrExit at that time, which was signed by a number of our CEOs as well as by ourselves, which did receive some publicity at the time, which made it clear the biggest threat was around fresh produce because of the delays that we've heard about and the short shelf lives that we have to move that product from farms in places like Spain and Holland to the shelves in the UK.
Right. So do you have any explanation at all as to why the Secretary of State should have said there will be no shortages of fresh food, given what you've just told us? On what basis he might have said it?
No.
No. Okay. Now, Jeremy Lefroy wanted to come in at this point.
During the recess, I visited a business in my constituency which is the largest grower of spinach in the UK and probably the largest grower of iceberg lettuces and other lettuces, and they expressed exactly the concern that Mr. Opie has said about because during the off-season, when obviously they have to continue to supply their customers, but they do it from Spain, they cannot see how they're going to be able to do that as effectively as they do at the moment. So that very much backs up as against what the government was saying, what the business who know what they're talking about are saying. If I could also ask, this 6-month period during which basically the UK is going to have an open border, is that not a smuggler's charter?
I think clearly, I don't think HMRC would have described it as an open border. We wouldn't have described it as an open border, and the normal sort of security type of checks would certainly still apply. There would be no diminution or change to any of those. What would not be happening would be physical checks on every lorry as they arrived in Dover to check whether they have the correct customs documentation. But the easements that HMRC are applying would enable people to discharge their customs processes away from the border and subsequently. So it wouldn't be a real-time process, it would be something that they could legitimately do after they've brought the goods into the country. So that helps. Clearly, because the processes wouldn't be 100% initially, there would be some potential issues of people getting away with not doing customs documentation, but HMRC would be, I know, with Border Force, aiming to increase controls and checks at the rate that they could do that without interrupting the flow of goods. So that was the approach, that it would gradually ramp up over a period of time as they could do that legitimately. And the aim was also to use intelligence, of course, which they do at the moment, to target high-risk organisations and make sure that high-risk organisations would be followed up and interrogated. So,
was there any assessment of when those checks, i.e. the red tape, was being ramped up, how much extra red tape that would mean for British business?
I mean, the sort of 6-month period allows the easements to continue for that 6-month period, including the easement on safety and security checks, which is one of the things that would have been problematic. The aim that HMRC was planning was how quickly can they put in place automated solutions or different solutions which would make it much easier for industry to be able to carry out the checks or prepare the right paperwork so that they weren't overly bureaucratic. But clearly, the requirement from day one on every importer is to still do customs processes. So it wouldn't be an increase in checks or in customs processes. It would be an increase, I suppose, in the government process of how it can identify whether people have carried out the right processes.
And just finally, Chair, if I may, on this subject, turning to the question of VAT on imports, how ready do you think that businesses are and to have in place the financial facilities to cope with VAT on imports where that will now be applicable?
I'm no expert on VAT, so I'm probably you might want to ask HMRC specifically on that. Our sense from business community was that it was customs processes which was much more likely to be problematic for them than the VAT processes. They obviously already have good processes for VAT, and although there would be differences, that was never described to us as a significant problem for them. They were much more concerned about the customs processes because that was new and much more complicated than some of the VAT processes. But I couldn't actually tell you how ready businesses were.
Could I just make an extra point with VAT? Sure. Because one of the big points we're making to government at the moment is they could considerably ease the pressure, ease the burden on all of these systems by reconsidering the decision to abolish something called low-value consignment relief. Now, the government has decided to do this ahead of the rest of Europe, but this effectively brings into the import VAT net consignments, relatively small consignments, often consumer-to-consumer consignments, so internet sales effectively, below the value of £25. And this, I've seen various estimates for the number of shipments which would then have to be declared and on which VAT would be payable, and it's several tens of millions a year. This is causing huge concerns amongst the carriers, the parcel and express courier businesses that are responsible for bringing these goods into the country. So quite apart from being a business burden, it would also throw a huge additional stress onto what would already, I suspect, be highly pressured computer systems in HMRC. And it's a very simple step for the government to take, simply to delay this and at least align with the timing the rest of Europe's adopted.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Stephen Timms.
Jack, can I go back, Ms. Wheeler, to what you were saying about trucks turning up at Dover-Calais not having the correct documentation? And you said at least 20% of the trucks turning up, according to the HMRC estimate, when you were there, would be in that position. Were you referring to UK trucks arriving at Dover to go into the EU, or EU trucks arriving at Calais to come into the UK?
Well, it's a good question, because obviously the only estimate that we were able to make on readiness of organisations was about UK businesses, and UK businesses generally will be exporting their goods rather than on the import side. But we had no real way of estimating how many organisations would be ready for French customs, and it would obviously be the readiness for French customs that would cause the problems. Yeah. So we were using our own figures of UK businesses as a proxy for what we anticipated would be the case for French businesses. And that may have been wrong. I know the French took a slightly more optimistic view of the numbers of businesses that would be ready. They like us, believed that the lack of readiness by organisations was the biggest hurdle to free flow across Calais and Dover. I think they I can't remember what number they thought, but they were slightly more optimistic about their numbers, but they hadn't done the detailed modelling and analysis that we'd done on our numbers. So I wasn't sure I had complete confidence in their modelling.
That's very helpful, though. So, estimated at least 20% of the trucks turning up at Dover won't have the correct documentation. Is that because there won't be an EORI number, or is it other things that are
So I should emphasise, of course, that this was our assessment and assumptions as of June. And one of the key things that caused that was because a very large number of businesses were still listening to what was being talked about and saying, no deal is never going to happen, so why should I bother? I don't need to invest this resource and effort into getting my business ready for a no deal because, government is telling us it's never going to happen. We always thought, even then, that if there was a change in Prime Minister and a change of the narrative about no deal, that would have a very significant impact on the number of businesses who suddenly said, no deal might happen, I'd better prepare. So those numbers, I think, almost certainly are shifting, and the numbers that I was referring to may have shifted significantly. However, the other factor, I think, is that big businesses have capability and resource to be able to prepare for customs. Small businesses and SMEs don't. They're normally busy trying to keep their business going and can't really take time out and money out to hire customs agents that might never be used. A large number of those trucks will be associated with small businesses, and I would expect, and I think we all expected, that the small businesses might still leave it to the wire before they started to prepare. And if they left it to the wire, then they would not have enough time. You can't get these things done within a day. So that would be a problem.
So is it essentially about getting an EORI number, or is it other things?
Yes, so the EORI number is literally the prerequisite. If you can't do a customs declaration unless you've registered with HMRC, and the process is they give you an EORI number. But that is a 2-minute job. The difficult job is carrying out a customs declaration, for which typically businesses find that so complex that they hire a specialist customs agent to be able to help them through that complicated process, because there are thousands of commodity codes for all the different products, depending not only on what they are but where they come from, and how they are sourced. You have to apply rules of origin. It is a complex process, so not something that Joe Blogs will normally be able to do. Just
one more question, if I may, then I'll ask Mr. Holcomb to comment. But if a truck turns up at Dover without the correct documentation, what would you expect to happen? I mean, one possibility, surely, is that the truck will be sent back. Sorry, you haven't got it, you've got to go. Or do you envisage it'll sit there for hours or maybe days while some process is pursued? What will actually happen in practice?
What would happen in practice is, so the French have their computerised systems ready so that they would expect, if you have got a customs declaration, you will be able to scan that and you'll go into a green lane and then they will let you through.
Will this happen in Dover or in Calais?
It will happen as part of the ferry crossing process. So it is normally, as you board the ferry or as you board the Eurotunnel, then that scanning process would happen on the carrier or as part of boarding the carrier, and that would enable trucks to be that have got the correct documentation to be waved through into a green lane, and that would enable them to go into France. The truck that doesn't have the correct documentation, it will be waved into a red lane, and the red lane will be where the French will then stop the truck, look to see what documentation that they've got. Now, they estimated that they might hold those trucks at what they told us, but informally they told us that they might hold those trucks for between 2 and 8 hours, and they would that almost certainly wouldn't be enough for that truck to be able to get the correct documentation, but it might be enough time for them to collect enough detail from the truck driver about the goods to enable them to then subsequently follow up and get the right customs documentation. But these So they weren't sure, I don't think, exactly how long they would be holding those trucks and what they would do with them, and whether they would let them go before they've got customs documentation or not. Those were things they were working through at the time.
That's very helpful. So these trucks will be held in Calais for
Yes.
a period. Do we know what the capacity is in Calais for holding trucks?
We understood there was something like 300 spaces that
300?
were allocated in Calais for holding trucks that were not ready.
But you've told us that at least 20% of the trucks will be in this position, so the 300 spaces will pretty quickly fill up.
That was precisely why we estimated that there would very quickly end up being queues, because they would fill up those spaces, which would be full potentially for at least 8 hours, which would mean for the course of that day, effectively, no more trucks could cross and be held up unless they are ready with the correct documentation.
So the queues would be in Dover, would they?
Queues would be in Dover because they wouldn't be able to cross into France, yes.
You can't send anyone else, so the queues will be here. Okay, thank you. Mr. Hookham.
I was just going to hopefully illuminate your question a little bit, because, of course, if the truck is carrying a consignment from one seller to one buyer, then it's relatively a straightforward process, a full container load, a full vehicle load. A huge proportion of the goods going across is on groupage, so multiple consignments in one vehicle. And, of course, the vehicle could be detained, even though only one or two handful of the actual consignments in the back of the vehicle don't have the right paperwork. So we're very, very dependent in those kinds of loads on everything being right first time. And the chances of that not happening are then multiplied probably by an order of magnitude when you look at parcels and mail traffic, where you could have thousands of consignments possibly needing each one needing an individual declaration.
Right.
So it could be very, very dependent on just one or two poor declarations or
Right.
poorly informed declarations. Could I also just say, in addition to all the checks about the loads, there is a whole range of new requirements coming in for the vehicle and the driver. So there will be new paperwork and documentation giving effectively the truck the permission to travel on the roads of the EU. The driver will need driving permits and so on. Range of other items that are going to need to be complied with by the haulier as opposed to the consigner of the goods. And these could also be potential points of enforcement and potential delay if they're not fully complied with. So there's going to be a lot to get right first time.
Just a little further, if I may, Jack. I wonder if you can just talk us through what will happen for trucks coming the other way. So trucks turning up at Calais, we don't know what proportion of them won't have the right documentation. What would happen to them? Would they be checked as they go onto the ferry as well? Who would do that checking, and what are the requirements that they'd have to meet?
No, there wasn't going to be a process of certainly we weren't asking the French to check trucks before they got onto the ferry or Eurotunnel, and we wouldn't. The aim, again, unless something has changed, the aim was not to implement a formal routine check on every truck as it entered the UK. So that's why, so long as trucks, there were enough lorries that weren't being held up in Kent, then imports would not be slowed by British customs and other controls.
Right, so on that basis, can we be reasonably relaxed about food supplies coming into the UK?
No, because there are only so many trucks, and if you've got 6,000 or 10,000 trucks stuck in a queue in Kent, then they are not going to be able to go across to Europe, pick up the food and bring it back. So some will, of course, but it will be a lot slower. That's the main source of the delay on foods, is because the trucks are held up, stuck in a queue this side.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce that, a third of trucks going back are empty. So they've brought the food over, they've brought it to us so we can sell it, and they're going back empty to pick up the next load from Spain or Holland or wherever. So it's just a continuous circle. I mean, the supply chain moves 24/7. If you have a dislocation wherever it is in that circle, then it affects the food supply chain. So it doesn't really matter whether it's this side of the channel or the other side of the channel. If you break that circle, then that's a problem.
But if you've got a truck bringing food in and then going straight back, presumably it'll have no difficulty going back because it won't have a load that needs to be.
It'll be in a queue behind all of those other ones.
It will be yes, it will be in a queue. So that's the problem. At the time. So 30%, as Andrew says, 30% of trucks going through Dover-Calais are empty. And they will be able to go through, they won't be held up, of course. So that increases the flow through Dover-Calais. That's not the case at Eurotunnel, because empty trucks tend to go through Dover-Calais because it's cheaper, so they won't pay the extra premium if they're empty. So they can certainly go across and pick up goods, but the issue is, they're stuck for a day in a queue in Kent before they actually get as far as Dover.
Just one final point, if I may, Chair. There was a bit of confusion at the end of August about whether UK businesses need one EORI number, a GB number, or two, whether they need an EU EORI number as well. Has that now been clarified?
My understanding, it probably has, and I don't know the official answer to this, but my understanding was always there were two separate numbers, a GB number and a French number. But
yeah, that is true. Yes, because you're effectively interacting with two different
authorities.
Right.
So they're a similar number. They look similar, but one has GB at the start of it, I think.
Right.
And one.
But I mean, you made the point to us that lots of UK businesses don't have a GB EORI number. I mean, presumably they won't. I mean, the proportion that have got a French EORI number will be less still.
Well, I mean, not necessarily, but it's certainly there are two completely separate processes. And if they are going to trade in both directions, they need both. But if they're only trading in one direction, obviously, then they only need one.
And we have successfully persuaded HMRC to issue automatically an EORI number to every VAT registered business that they are aware of. So if you like, everyone's going to get one. So hopefully that will initiate a process that says, I now need to register and
but that'll just be a GB EORI number, not a French.
Still need an EU one, which of course is not something we can.
No.
Is in the UK's gift to deliver.
Very helpful, thank you. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can I start, Crabb, by asking you some questions about the Yellowhammer report? I appreciate that maybe things that you still aren't able to tell us, but I'm trying to get clear what the actual nature of the document was, because the Times certainly gave the impression that they had received a document, either in paper or electronic form, that had a date on it and that was current as of that date. Government sources, or some of them, have tried to suggest that it was something much more vague, that it was a collection of pieces of information back and forward that never actually stopped, and it was a kind of work in progress. And Michael Gove certainly tried to imply that it was already at the date of the Times got it. Are you able to tell us anything of what you know as to the currency of the information in Yellowhammer at the time that the Times got it in early August?
I'm not sure there's much light I can shed on that. I wasn't familiar with all of the Yellowhammer plans. I was responsible for two of them that related to disruption at the border for goods and for people. Every plan got written down in some way, but I'm not sure how that got collated into any single document and what date that document was. From my reading of the newspaper and what I read in the newspaper about the report, for the sections that I read, they looked completely like the documents that I would have seen before. So they looked entirely valid at the point in time, but but I can't comment on the actual document because I don't know what it was.
Right. Were you still working on that document pretty much until the time you left the service in July this year? Or was it something that had been done months and months ago?
Oh yeah, no, it was constantly being refreshed and updated. Obviously, some things got sort of landed, and then you didn't particularly update them because they were still current. But I know our border assumptions on goods going through the border was a fundamentally important one for all of the Yellowhammer plans, and therefore we were constantly updating it.
If anything significant had happened that would have either changed underlying assumptions or changed your assessment as to the impact, presumably it would have been incumbent on you to update.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. You gave a very helpful explanation as to what the kind of phrase a reasonable worst case scenario would mean. I think you said it was something that was possible but at the less likely end of the scale of probabilities. Are there standard criteria that the civil service would use in deciding at what point in the spectrum you draw the line and say that is a reasonable worst case scenario? Anything worse than that is probably not going to happen?
We struggled a lot with this, found it very difficult to do something that was formulaic, that couldn't be challenged. The only way that we could do it was by cross-government, a group of cross-government Director Generals agreeing that they do seem likely, and each of the sub-assumptions underneath each of the assumptions was normally owned by a particular department, and then they would provide as much evidence as they could of that, and provide evidence associated with why they think that assumption is likely or less likely. Some of them were very difficult to provide evidence for, and some actually you could. So,
is it possible to quantify in any useful sense the probability that the reasonable worst case or something worse will happen, alternatively the reasonable best case or something better with it? I'm just trying to get some kind of indication as to how confident can we be, for example, that the best and worst case scenarios you've outlined for freight traffic, that we're going to finish up somewhere in there. Can we be optimistic that it'll be better than that? Do we need to worry that there's a significant probability that it could be even worse than that? Is there a kind of a point in which you say a 60% probability, an 80% probability, a 5% probability? Is there anything even approximate that puts numbers on it?
We were often being asked to try and put probabilities around the assumptions, as you can imagine. I don't think we could do that with any other basis than a sort of finger in the air. Ultimately, it gets down to how people behave. The fundamental bottleneck on trucks going through Dover-Calais is how the French deal with the blockage. And you could take a very worst case assumption, which is that they will stop and not let anything go until every formality has been completely covered, and that will take days, and therefore, it will become extremely difficult to get things across the border. And the best case will be 100% of every trader and truck is ready as perfect documentation, and it goes through. So there are some boundaries, but they just are not realistic. So I don't think there was any way of doing this other than coming to a sensible judgment.
Or of course, the French officials take a similar risk-based assessment of the threats, which is what HMRC will be doing, which is exactly what they do now. And certainly my members would argue, well, if the goods are no different, the carriers are no different, the issue's no different the first week of November than it was the last week of October. So it's purely a pragmatic observation.
Yes, we spent a lot of time worrying about what the French would do. We knew they would obey the rules. but we know they are also in favour of trying to get flow going. So somewhere between complete obeying the rules and a pragmatic approach is where they're likely to act. That might be impacted by the politics of the no deal and how fractious it is, but it's very hard to predict exactly how that would work.
So could I also offer just another view on how to think about Yellowhammer, because this is the process we went through when we saw the story. And my first question was, well, what are the assumptions that underlie all of this? So one of the big ones is the enforcement approach by French customs. But also there are some certain easements that have been agreed by each party in the run-up to March the 29th that removed some of the real showstopper issues that I've spoken to this committee about before. So, for example, the European Commission agreed that not every single journey made by a British truck into the EU would require one of these haulage permits, the ECMT permit. And there was a sort of a stay on it of execution on that particular requirement that was signed off in Brussels and was valid until the end of the year, which was reasonably generous given an exit date in March, but was practically useless when it was rolled forward to October. So one of our big asks in Brussels has been for that concession, and a similar one was agreed for aviation issues, simply to be rolled forward by at least the period of time that Brexit had been delayed. Now, your assessment about the severity of delays would be very highly influenced by what you assumed the outcome of that to be. Because if those provisions were not eased, then it wouldn't simply be a question of being ready. As I've explained before, there simply are not enough permits to meet the demand. So it's a question of permission to travel rather than readiness to comply. It would be interesting to understand what assumptions were made in the assessment about those kind of easements, because if they were assumed to apply, if those easements were assumed to have been carried forward, then we need to make sure that happens. And there are similar easements that were allowed by the UK government. Karen's mentioned the safety and security declarations, which again would have a significant bearing on the number of trucks able to comply coming into the country. So again, was the assumption that that easement would be renewed or not, because it would significantly affect the outcome.
Thank you. If I could come back to you, Karen, after the Yellowhammer document was leaked, an unnamed number 10 source said this document is from when ministers were blocking what needed to be done to get ready to leave. Those obstructing preparation are no longer in government. Now, throughout the last several years, the policy of the government, regardless of who the ministers have been, the policy has been we don't want to leave without a deal, but we're actively preparing for it. Did you, any time in your time in HMRC, have any concerns that anyone in the civil service, or indeed any ministers, were actively blocking the government's own policy of preparing for a no-deal Brexit?
No, not at all. I think generally people were supportive of trying to find solutions so that the preparations would succeed. So I think that's true. There were, of course, always conversations about money, about how funding might best solve some of the problems or not. And of course, it was always Treasury's job to make sure that there's an appropriate judgment between spending money to ease the problems and getting value for money and not disrupting trade as well. So there were those sorts of discussions, but I don't think they were trying to block preparations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Stephen Crabb.
Did you finish now? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Okay, thank you, Jim. Can I ask a couple of broad questions? I read today in the newspaper that the government's going to announce another £2 billion to help with no-deal planning. And of course, we've heard some of these announcements before, and we've read headlines suggesting that the government's going to increase the pace of preparations. From where you sit in your organisations, have you noticed any difference when these announcements get made? Does it translate into an increase in the tempo of preparation? Is it something that you can feel from your interactions with government agencies? I don't know who wants to lead off.
The short answer is actually yes, because the money is often actually largely for the government's own use to equip itself with the means of enforcing a border and managing, for example, the Operation Brock situation. There's been recent announcements about that. The government did announce money was available for trade associations to support communication activity, and certainly the FTA will be seeking to make use of that, because the communication task is now huge. We are grateful for that support, because we only have limited means ourselves of delivering this scale of communication exercise. I think the important thing, though, is that whilst that funding is helpful, there are still many issues that the government still needs to resolve upon and sign off on around the actual border procedures, because in communicating what businesses need to do, we need to be in possession of the complete picture. And at the moment, there are several really important missing pieces of the overall picture that we just need to get some clarity on. And we are sending regularly to the government, to Michael Gove in particular, our shopping list, our hit list of issues that remain undecided, and therefore we can't give the clarity of advice and information to our members that we would like. So, yes, there is a willingness to support business and trade bodies in particular to communicate this information, but we still need to know completely what that information is to deliver that.
Okay.
I mean, I would agree. I think the additional spending is always welcome, and particularly if it does work in terms of information being cascaded further up the supply chain. In our experience, it tends to be the larger companies are more attuned to this, they understand it better, but the further up the supply chain you go, the harder it is to engage those suppliers to be ready. And I include European suppliers in that, of course, not just UK suppliers. So for us, we're primarily talking about imports. We need our European suppliers to understand what they need to do and to reassure them as well, because one of the fears we have is European suppliers may worry that their trucks are delayed here for 2 or 3 days, and therefore why supply the GB when you could supply Germany and just drive your truck straight from Spain to Germany, for example. So I think it is welcome, but I think the pace is actually often set by the political agenda rather than necessarily the government's agenda, if that makes sense. So certainly when it got to the end of July into August, we saw a significant increase in inquiries coming into us from all of our members and from them through their supply chains about the risk of no deal, kind of dusting off their plans that they had made for March again and then preparing to ramp those up ahead of October. So that's what really sets the pace of engagement, I think.
So as best I understand, as best I've heard directly from Boris Johnson describing it to me, the strategy is about showing that the UK is credibly ready to walk through the pain barrier of the 31st of October, and that's the moment when you can show that you create maximum pressure to try and get a better deal from the EU. This whole concept of being ready, is that the correct way of looking at it? Is there ever going to be a point where people like yourselves can turn around to civil servants and senior politicians and say, the work is now done, we are, from where we sit, ready? Or is it just that's the wrong way of handling that concept?
I think you can have that conversation to say we are as ready to manage the system as it stands, but within that you need to understand there are some consequences of that. In other words, retailers cannot manage the disruption that we're likely to see across the short straits. So we are ready in terms of our businesses are ready. We are managing stocks in advance of October the 31st. We're communicating with our suppliers. We are thinking about everything we need to do as a business, particularly if we export. All of those things, yes, we can say we are as ready as we possibly can be, but there is no getting away from the fact that a major dislocation, which is what we are like to see, will have a consequence for the food that we sell in our stores. And we've been very frank about that to say, yes, we will, and we've worked very closely with government to try and get as ready as possible, because our aim is to serve British consumers and make sure that they are, we mitigate the impact. But we are mitigating the impact. We cannot remove all of the impact.
Okay.
And so there's a difference between being ready and being able to mitigate all of the impacts.
So would you agree that there's no state of readiness that doesn't have a negative byproduct to it?
Well, I think there are kind of two questions. I think there is a state of readiness. So, if we knew all of the facts and we knew what we wanted to do, and we might talk about kind of how we trial some of those processes later, which we haven't had the opportunity to do yet. If we could do all that and we'd practiced and we're ready to go, you could say we are ready for what we expect to see. What we cannot be ever ready for is a major dislocation with our biggest trading partner, which is Europe, and that is further complicated by it being October the 31st, when we are very, very reliant on imports from Europe. So there's a difference, I think, between being ready and being able to wholly mitigate the impact.
I think what's really important in our view about being ready is distinct from it's all going to be fine. You can be ready for a crisis situation because you've got your crisis teams stood up, prepared to deal with the unexpected, and you can be ready to deal with the traffic queues in Kent and with potential impacts on supplies of goods. That doesn't mean they will go away. It's just that you're ready to cope with it. So I think it's being careful about what we mean by ready.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Mr. Hockham?
No.
That's fine.
Absolutely agree with that.
Can I just ask one final question, and it's to Mr. Opie, and it's slightly off-piece because it doesn't actually relate to cross-border movement of goods, but since you're before us, I think it's quite helpful to ask you. During the recess, I met with a very large poultry supplier who supply one of the leading high-quality supermarket brands with all of their organic turkeys at Christmas time. They were very spooked by the press reports, I think that came from people close to the Home Secretary, that freedom of movement for people would end abruptly on the 31st of October in the event of a no deal. They were explaining to me that it's early November they will bring in 200 Romanians, as they do every year, to help get the turkeys packed up and onto the shelves for the Christmas season. The question they're asking me is, if they've entered into contracts with agents now for that labour to come across, whether they will still be in a legal position to do so if freedom of movement ends abruptly on the 31st of October. When I've talked about this with ministers, they said, oh no, there's nothing to worry about. But do you pick up any concerns within your organisation about this?
I would say that's, aside the problem of bringing food over, the issue around immigration is the biggest threat facing the retail sector, not just our suppliers, and that was really well articulated. We've had the same discussions with the National Farmers Union. We're well aware of those businesses like turkey producers, obviously, who are bringing people over seasonally at that time. But retailers are also ramping up all of their operations at that time of the year. So our logistics and distribution networks are even busier than they are normally. So you're heading into Black Friday as well as into the Christmas deliveries. We rely also very heavily on EU workers who do a brilliant job in our system, and some of those will come over for that period specifically to work in the run-up to Christmas. So all of our retailers, food and non-food retailers, are saying they have a major concern about the impact that those signals that are coming out of the Home Office are giving to potential workers who may be in the EU at the moment, who would come over under normal circumstances to work in our businesses, because we really need those workers at that time of the year, whether it's in the supply chain or in our own logistics and distribution.
Has the government given enough assurances around that since those press reports in the summer?
I think it needs to be much, much clearer about what the situation will be, because we have a real fear that workers who are currently in Europe at the moment are not getting the reassurances that they would want to think, I'm going to go to the UK, I'm going to plan my trip to the UK, I'm going to work there for 3 to 6 months, whatever it is, I'm confident that I can go to the UK and work. And I think that's our real priority, is to give the clarity to those workers who are crucial to our system. And one interesting thing, of course, for your organic producer, he won't be able to export into Europe because we will not have certification and status as a third country with the EU on day one, and that's been made clear to us. So organic producers in this country, they're the worst facing, they've got the biggest problems in terms of food producers.
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay, and now John Whittingdale's got a quick question following that up.
Quick one to Mr. Opie. You've explained 31st of October is in some ways the worst possible time to choose to leave the European Union? Out of interest, when would be the best time?
Well, interesting. If I picked a time, I would probably pick about June. Early June would be the ideal time. We've switched fully over to UK produce at that time. So if you take lettuces, for example, where I think it almost flip-flops from 10% produced in the UK to 90% from Europe in the winter, to the other way around in the summer. So if you look, anybody who understands our seasonal production in this country will understand we source as much as we can here in the UK, and so that would be the best time. And the other thing about June, of course, is you would then have a bit of headroom, probably up to the end of October, to get all the systems working, everybody's ready to go. So if it was me, it's not me, but if it was, that's what I would pick.
Thank you.
That was a very, very succinct answer. June what year? No, you don't have to answer that. Vera Hophouse is next.
Thank you. We have already touched on the EU workforce, and I would like to elaborate a little bit longer. And particularly, I'm in close contact with the 3 million and the current EU workforce, and possibly people have seen what has gone through the press with Richard Bertinet, a famous baker from France, living in this country for over 30 years, having a family, living a British wife, British children, and he didn't get full settled status, but only pre-settled status. And I think we cannot overestimate the human cost, that the uncertainty over what is being said by this government, and particularly recently, creates to these people. I mean, it's just stressful. It's humanly very stressful. And no wonder that certainly a lot of EU citizens who are living here and working here currently are considering to leave. But what about that sentiment that is created in Europe? And of course, people see what's going on here. How has it actually already affected workforce?
I mean, in terms of our own workforces, we haven't seen major, numbers of EU migrants currently in our workforce leaving the UK. I think that would be true to say. I think it might be different in our supply chain, but I haven't caught up recently with the NFU to know what they would be saying about the kind of availability of workers. But I think there remains a concern. Those workers are really key to the food that we put on the shelves in the UK, and particularly acute in some areas of our businesses. So logistics and distribution being the obvious one. We did a survey of our own members a few years ago, and figures in logistics and distribution particularly high in the South East, East Midlands, West Midlands. So those workers are crucial to our system, and they need the reassurance. Now, we are working with the government to get that reassurance through our companies to their workers, because they're so valuable to their companies, but we're not seeing major departures at the moment.
But in terms of the future workforce that we were talking about?
Absolutely, and the current systems that are being proposed, we've made it clear, do not really sit well with us in terms of the demand for labour that we anticipate we will need going forward. That we don't anticipate the types of worker we are going to require going forward is going to change. We work really hard with UK communities here to try and recruit as many as we can from the local communities to work in our businesses. But again, it's back to a realistic assessment of what actually happens. Those figures are supplemented by great EU migrant workers who come and work in our businesses. So they are, that we are heavily dependent on those for moving food around the country.
So did actually the government discuss with you the labour needs for your industries?
Well, yes, I mean, we have engaged with government, and we obviously took part in various consultations over the last year, 18 months. We have made it clear where our demand for workers really needs to be, and if you look at a future immigration system, how that system works best for us, and some of the proposals that work worse for us, for example, setting a salary threshold that is too high and unrealistic for the type of worker that we would need in our businesses.
But obviously one of the big announcements from the Home Office was over the summer break that free movement would immediately end. Were you made aware of that?
We weren't, no.
That was...
We have a long-standing driver shortage in the logistics and the domestic logistics activity, and Our latest survey suggests that 13, 14, maybe 15% of our resident drivers, so just driving around the UK, this isn't international work, just resident drivers are from the rest of the EU. They hold non-UK driving licence issued by another EU member state. So they're absolutely fundamental to us providing, as an industry, the support to not just the food sector, but the retail sector, but all of British commerce, a distribution function. We have, it's not a question of simply substituting with UK drivers. Those drivers are not available, qualified to the standards necessary to drive a heavy goods vehicle. So our playback to government on this has been you need to revisit urgently your apprenticeship funding arrangements and the criteria for eligibility for funding, because all of a sudden your domestic training needs are fundamentally different to when that apprenticeship levy was designed and introduced. We need far more flexibility in the types of course that are eligible for funding, because if we are going to have to confront these new consequences of the ending of freedom of movement at some time, then we need to start on a process of sourcing the necessary skilled workers within the UK, and we therefore need an apprenticeship levy and training arrangements which actually suits that kind of environment. That's very different to when that scheme was first designed and introduced.
But could you sort of paint a scenario? Suddenly on the 31st of October we have no deal. What would that actually look like if really free movement and all the consequences would end that day? Well,
as been described, it could jeopardise the ability of, let's say, a driver from Eastern Europe to decide, as Andrew has described, to come and spend the peak season when there is the demand for drivers is greatest, working in the UK because there's reliable work and his driving or her driving licence remains valid. It's a very much used arrangement. Drivers do move between jobs on contracts, and if all of a sudden there are new checks and controls and requirements to register or seek certain status that wasn't there before, as we've discussed, it may well be far more attractive simply to go and do your work in Germany or France or somewhere where those checks don't require. And on top of the administrative burdens we're talking about, don't forget the actual financial attractiveness of working in the UK has declined quite dramatically, consistent with the fall in the value of the pound. It's simply not worth what it was to come over here and work. So we're fighting those forces in being an attractive employer as well.
And did you get the impression that actually government had thought this through, or was it just something that was announced because there seemed to have been a political opportune moment to say something like that?
No, I don't think there is a deep understanding in government of some of these second and third order consequences of the ending of the freedom of movement. And I think the government is still working its way through some of these consequences, and employers, members, are themselves struggling to come to the terms with exactly what they might have to do in order to give advice to current employees and presumably to encourage them to complete whatever paperwork and registration they need to, because clearly these are very valuable employees and they would like to keep them. So they're working through those consequences as well.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Harold Williams, apologies.
Thank you, Chair, good morning. There's been quite a lot of attention given this morning already and in the press to the situation between Calais and Dover, the narrow straits crossing, but less attention, I think, to what's happening between Ireland and Wales, essentially, which is what I'd like to ask you about. Now, God knows there are sufficient complications between Northern Ireland and the Republic, so I don't want to go into any of that, especially as we don't have anyone from Northern Ireland here, as we usually have. So I'd just like to talk about perishable foods. I did meet some food producers from Northern Ireland a few months ago in a meeting organised by the then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and asked them a few questions about the trade north-south and particularly west-east. And again, I think that they were quite concerned that insufficient attention being given to this. So just firstly, there's a lot of sort of primary products, chicken or whatever, and also manufactured meals and that sort of thing, which are very time sensitive, which go north, south. So what's your understanding as far as the Republic is concerned as to the checks that they will impose and whatever else? Is it going to be as with Calais? I mean, there's been a great deal of talk about not having any physical infrastructure on the border itself. So how do you understand that trade will be affected if we leave with no deal?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
So the Dublin-Holyhead route was probably next on my list in terms of priority after Dover-Calais, because it's the next busiest route. It's 20 crossings a day as opposed to about 60 for Dover-Calais, and as you say, it's a huge source of all sorts of goods, but a lot of food goods. And very time sensitive to the shops opening and getting goods in. So exactly the same situation will apply between Dover and Holyhead as between Holyhead and Dublin as between Dover and Calais, i.e. the Irish will have to do customs checks and SBS checks on goods entering Dublin from Holyhead. And at Holyhead, again, just as in Dover, the UK is not going to put any controls and checks in the way of goods coming from Dublin. On the plus side, associated with that, because of the fewer frequency, because it's only 20 crossings as opposed to 60 crossings a day, our estimate was, while there would likely be delays because of the time taken for checks happening in Dublin, they would all be constrained within a day. So you wouldn't get queues building up over days as you would in Dover and Kent. So the impact on the delays will not be, necessarily 12 plus hours. But as you say, some of those delays are very time sensitive, and if they miss the 2 o'clock ferry, they don't hit the 5 o'clock deadline for getting into the shops. So those sensitivities are there, and there were concerns about that. I know there were concerns as we talked to Northern Ireland stakeholders that if there were likely to be delays on that route, then would traders choose to go through the border, which would not have any delays, at least on our side of the border, because the UK government was not going to put any controls and checks on any of the goods going across the land border. But of course then they would need to go across the land border and to the Northern Ireland, the northern port, into Larne, into Scotland, and that's a much longer route.
Other way.
Yeah, so the assessment was probably that not a lot would choose to reroute through the land border because it would be more difficult to do that. But there was another attraction, of course, through that route, which is that you get no tariffs and no customs through that route. So there could well be some trade disruption and some different flows of trade which would have impacts. But Andrew's probably better placed to say what the industry view.
Yeah, it's a big problem. A number of UK retailers operate stores in the Republic and actually accounts for quite a large percentage of their grocery market. Lots of that food is shipped from GB over to Ireland through Dublin. And it's really kind of highlights the problems of becoming a third country and then trying to export into the EU. The food export rules into the EU are not set up for retail just-in-time deliveries. They are really set up for a large consignment of New Zealand lamb coming over, the same kind of product. It's relatively easy to have one export health certificate. A retailer will be sending over maybe 200, 300 different products. A large proportion of those will have products of animal origin, so that's either meat or that's meat products that have been manufactured here in GB and shipped over. Each of those needs its own export health certificate, which needs to be signed off by a vet. So the lorry has to carry multiple certificates with it to do that. Any mistakes, obviously the lorry is then held and the appropriate paperwork needs to be sent. So the system of trying for a retailer to try and work through all of that system and send the same supply that we are currently sending is nigh on impossible, just from the bureaucracy and the administration of trying to get through all of the rules that you need to do to send that vehicle across, because the Irish have told us that they will administer all of the rules in Dublin, including the pallets that we talked about earlier. They are saying, this is the border with the EU, you need to send stuff over. But it will have a significant impact on GB retailers or UK retailers trying to send product to their Republic of Ireland stores.
I think that's excellent summary, and I certainly agree.
I mean, mindful of the previous answers that you gave on preparedness, is there the same degree of preparedness as far as Dublin Holyhead is concerned, as far as compared with Dover-Calais?
We were probably less close to Dublin's arrangements than we were to Calais and Eurotunnel's arrangements. We have very close relationships with the French, who worked very closely with us. Obviously, they were constrained by what they could do and say by the EU, but nevertheless, we got quite familiar with it. We have not been able to get as close to Irish arrangements because Ireland has been less willing to talk to UK about border arrangements. So I would have less confidence in them, but that's not to say that they are not prepared. But I could see that the French were very well prepared, and that's why I've probably just got less confidence because I've less cited on them. But we worked on the assumption that they would be able to, cope as well as the French with their arrangements. There would probably be more teething problems there. So they're used to operating systems. It's just not at Dublin. But yeah.
Just another question that I asked the Northern Ireland food producers. I asked them, do you know how much of what proportion of your exports to the south then go on to the UK? I mean, and they didn't really seem to know, give me an actual percentage. And it's an imponderable in a situation where there are quite enough details to deal with already, as it were.
No, I tried to. I personally, when I was there, tried to get a better handle on percentage of goods and trade flows and products travelling through the various routes. They're very difficult to pin down because, of course, up to date, we don't have any information. So the only information that we would ever get would be through the ports and the carriers themselves, through industry giving us that information, and DEFRA probably had a better picture of that as far as agri-food good, but I can't.
Well, we're going over to Ireland shortly, and we'll have a go at them again. I mean, just lastly, it seems to me that the preparations are focused on day one and then for a few months subsequently. Just if we can stand back a little bit, I think it was Pascal Lamy who was before us said that we might be able to prepare in the short term, but it's when divergence occurs that the problems will really stack up. I mean, is that your view as well? And,
absolutely, and actually I think there's been too little debate around the 3, 6, 9 month period. So for us, for example, we will have a temporary tariff on food, but how long will that temporary tariff last? How sustainable is it to last? SPS checks on goods coming into the UK from outside the EU. It's not sustainable not to administer those checks, because surely the New Zealanders and the Australians who are acting as third countries and exporting food into the UK would say, why is our food being checked and European food is not similarly being checked? So for me, I think there's the immediate disruption and dislocation around the 1st of November, which will have serious consequences, particularly in fresh produce. But actually, for the consumer perspective, there's so much uncertainty from not having a robust deal with our biggest trading partner. And there's no getting away from that. The EU, 80% of food imports into UK supermarkets come from the EU. So probably about 25% of everything we sell comes from the EU. A fraction comes from the rest of the world. And actually only, I think about 10% of the products we sell currently attract a tariff, which is probably 10% of imports, which is probably about 3% of the products we sell. So all of these are like really big questions that need to be answered quite quickly, because otherwise they're going to have a huge impact on consumer prices going forward. And it's not manageable to do, we cannot, all what we've said always, the best thing for consumers would be a good deal with our immediate trading partner with the EU. Should be the first consequence of the Brexit, and then you move on to trading partners after that. But for food, we are so reliant on that EU trade that we need to secure that really, really quickly. And of course, the dislocation of going with a no deal may make that trading arrangement harder going forward, and to get a deal as well.
I think it's worth saying, part of my role when I was there was to look at all scenarios, whether it was deal or no deal. Inevitably, we ended up spending much more of our time on no deal because it was the one thing that we could actually pin down and know what the plan was. Whereas deal scenarios, and including what happens after day one, the longer term scenario after a no deal, do you carry on having a no deal, or do you actually subsequently get a deal after that no deal, because obviously you're still trying to make a trade arrangement? The problem was, and probably still is, lots of people want to plan for those scenarios, but what scenario are you planning for? And what is the best set of scenarios that you should plan for? So that is the difficulty. I think everyone in government is trying to work out. So in Ireland, for example, it was clear that both the customs regime and the tariff regime would both be not sustainable long term. They would both therefore only apply for a short period of time. So therefore, what's the plan after the short period of time to get out of that? I'm sure people were thinking about it, but it wasn't clear what the solutions were. Because once you know what the solution is, you think, well, why don't I go straight to that? And that isn't obvious. There's absolutely people worrying about it, but I think it is actually quite hard to pin down because it's not known policy.
It reminds me of a colleague of mine who used to say, don't start a fight in a pub unless you know where the back door is.
Well, that's very wise advice in many circumstances. Can I just pick up 2 points, and I know that Joanna before he wants to come back in. Food price rises, Mr. Opie. Now, the government has said, well, could be some food price rises, but there could also be some food price reductions because of the new tariff schedule, although the one that was published has now been, in effect, withdrawn. The government is consulting on a new one. We don't yet know when it's going to appear. What is your assessment of what the overall effect will be? Do you accept there will be price reductions as well as rises, and what will the overall effect be on the consumer?
It's really difficult to predict food prices, but we can look at some of the pressures that are like to be on food prices, I think. One of the key things is we probably are expecting a further devaluation of the pound, and the pound, both against the euro and the dollar, is really important for food prices, because then you incorporate things like oil as well as commodity prices themselves, and we're expecting that to happen. We are expecting there to be extra costs in the system in a no-deal situation. There'll be extra waste, there'll be extra costs for distribution because you'll need 2 drivers, or your lorry will be stuck for 2 days, so you won't be able to get it over. The tariff thing is great, but don't forget, we already operate on zero tariff schedule with the EU, so there's no saving in the zero tariff, we're just taking that over here. And further than that, we inevitably will, unless we can compensate all of our food exporters who also form the backbone of our supply chain, they are going to come under increasing pressure because they will find it very hard to export to their key market in Europe because of the high tariffs. So my view is, if you put all of those together, the weight looks as if they are inflationary pressures there, and it's difficult to see whether deflationary prices would be in that.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. Now, Ms Wheeler, can we just look at the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? First of all, what was the government's planning assumption about what would actually happen at the border on day one? And then I want to come on to the point you just made a moment ago about the unsustainability of what might be happening.
So the government published its policy in February, March about how it would avoid infrastructure at the border, which was the priority for the government. So, the policy was no customs and a minimum amount of essential checks on certain goods in certain circumstances. So that was to avoid having to do any sorts of checks at a border. What that would mean is, in principle, then any imports from Republic of Ireland would be able to cross into Northern Ireland without any sort of checks or customs or tariffs. So that flow would potentially be fine. But the trade in the opposite direction would not, because the Ireland would have to, our assumption was Ireland will have to impose customs and SPS checks on goods from Northern Ireland.
At the border?
Well, it has said it will have to do those checks, but it is not going to put any infrastructure on the border.
Right.
And therefore it has started to talk about ways of trying to do that away from the border. So I don't think they've been hugely detailed or specific about exactly what and how they would do that, but they would aim to do SPS checks in existing facilities in other locations away from the border. Now, the difficulty with that is the tariff differential would immediately make it uneconomic. Is how stakeholders, I can only really tell you what stakeholders in Northern Ireland told us. They told us that it would immediately become uneconomic for Northern Ireland agri-food businesses to trade with Republic of Ireland because of the tariff and potential customs control barriers, especially in the circumstances where they don't actually know what would happen and how it would happen in Ireland. So their sense was that would stop, and that would be exacerbated by the fact that they would be able to see Republic of Ireland traders being able to still bring their goods into Northern Ireland without any barrier and without any tariffs. And that in itself would cause problems, immediate, within days, even hours, I think some of the stakeholders were saying, would cause issues for Northern Ireland traders, businesses to go out of business. So that was the situation as we were anticipating. We obviously weren't anticipating delays as such, but simply a stop of normal trading business going across the border.
And that's got a real human dimension, because if you think of the haulier instructing the driver that morning, make your usual journey south into the Republic, is that driver going to be held somehow accountable for maybe retrospective or delayed checks that the Republic may want to make on that vehicle? There's quite an interesting grey area here between what is deemed to be smuggling, because no declarations are made, and in this situation it's a very, very vague legal area, but there will be individuals needing to confront that and run that risk. That's not fair on dropping the political indecision down onto the daily working lives of individual drivers and hauliers.
Now, you said it wouldn't be sustainable, and indeed the Operation Yellowhammer said that.
Yes.
So what would have to happen next?
Well, that was sort of precisely the problem. It's not sustainable because the border between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland would be potentially subject to challenge by other EU countries saying, well, that's not fair, it would break WTO rules. So the assumption was that that could be sustained for a period, but months or up to 12 months. And what was not clear was what happens then after 12 months. I think the assumption was that there would need to be some sort of special deal, which obviously takes you into a different place. But it was not clear what that's... Well, it wasn't clear to me, and I wasn't cited on any policy thinking about what that might look like.
Sounds like some kind of backstop arrangement, but yeah, I might say that, and you may not want to comment. Right, and you'd said earlier that the ability to have effective communication with your Irish counterparts was more difficult.
Yes.
In that they were less willing to share with you what, in fact, it was that they were going to do.
Yes,
Is that...
absolutely. So I think UK government officials and ministers were constantly trying to have conversations, but Ireland officials and ministers, as far as I could see, were simply not able or willing to talk to us about no-deal arrangements. My assumption was that there, at that point at least, wasn't a no-deal plan. There was certainly an assumption by the Republic of Ireland that no deal could not happen, would not happen because it could not happen. And therefore it wasn't clear that there was a plan at all. Now I'm sure there is some sort of plan now, but it's not clear what it is, and certainly by the end of June we still weren't able to talk to them about it.
All right, that's very clear. Now, Jeremy.
Yes, I do apologise. I had another meeting very briefly. I wanted to just and apologise if you've already answered this. It seems to me, therefore, that you have the two cliff edges with no deal. You have the cliff edge of whenever it is, 31st of October, which hopefully won't be the case. But then, after a period of time, non-EU countries will challenge the situation, and as you said, the border situation in Ireland may be challenged by other EU countries. At what point do you think non-EU countries will say Britain is not complying with the WTO rules about fair treatment of all other parties to the WTO, and would there be a risk of us being excluded from the WTO if we weren't to respond to that and therefore impose similar tariffs on food coming in from the EU, which, as you said, is 80% of our imports, as we do from New Zealand or Australia or the United States?
You're definitely outside of my area. I wasn't really cited on the thinking. I know that government felt that their approach for Northern Ireland was legally compliant. They definitely felt that, but not sustainable. And I think the assessment of we would need within 12 months to move it to a different place probably reflected their assessment of the risk of challenge, but I don't know.
And as far as tariffs in general, not just for Northern Ireland, but tariffs for Ireland, tariffs for the whole EU being at 0% on certain things, food products particularly, which would have to then change to WTO tariffs, I would imagine.
So the EU would apply WTO tariffs on our goods coming in, but the UK tariff regime, which, as you know, was always identified as a sort of temporary regime, specifically to try and get the balance between what's legally required, what we need to do to protect certain specific goods and protect the protect the public from price rises. But that regime had not come in through a proper consultation process, which is normal for a tariff regime. So the assumption would be that within 12 months there would need to be a proper consultation around a different or possibly the same tariff regime. So I think there was more thinking about what that process and timescale would be, although I'm not clear what the new tariff regime might end up.
Presumably the same scenario that you painted between Northern Ireland producers being pretty upset about the disparity quickly in terms of their exports as against the other way round would apply to British people in Great Britain. So, for instance, a producer of spinach might find, I don't know what the tariffs would be on spinach, which they are exporting, say, to the Netherlands, but they might find that in the end it's cheaper to import those goods from Europe because the tariffs imposed by the UK are zero, rather than grow it ourselves.
That's beyond...
With the consequent impact on food security and much else.
It wouldn't stop us sourcing, because it would still be zero tariff whether we buy it from Lincolnshire or whether we buy it from Holland in that case, so that wouldn't affect them. But I think their problem is...
They wouldn't be able to export. For instance, the Netherlands in June had a very good period of hot weather, which meant that their production went right down, so British producers were able to fill that gap. That would no longer be nearly as profitable for British producers.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So British producers would be put again at a disadvantage by these arrangements.
Which is the dilemma with the tariffs on food, which are extremely high, but also are a real balance between consumers and producers.
Now, Stephen, I think you had...
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, can I go back to the discussion we were having earlier about what would happen in practice at Dover-Calais? You made the point that a third of the trucks that bring food into the UK go back empty to the EU, and the problem would be they'd be stuck in the queue in Dover with all the other trucks. This is no doubt a rather naive question, but couldn't you just introduce an empty lorry lane at Dover so they could bypass the queue, get straight on the ferry and go back?
So it's a good question, and it is one that, again, we were, with the Department for Transport, trying to explore the potential for doing BrExit readiness checks, really, and BrExit readiness checks would on lorries that were queuing to go out to Europe to check, did they have the correct documentation or were they empty? And ensuring then that the queues enabled the correct trucks with the correct documentation or empty were prioritised for going to Dover and Eurotunnel. So I know that work is underway to try to put in place those BrExit readiness checks to enable that to happen. The problem is BrExit readiness checks happen either can happen at Manston Airport, or they can happen while trucks are queuing, but there are no other locations where you can do those checks. Now, Manston Airport is only going to be full of trucks if the queues have already built up, and we can only do checks on trucks on the M20 if it's completely stationary. So there's a you do the checks if the trucks are stationary, you don't do them if it's flowing. But that work is underway to try and enable that to happen.
I think you need also to perhaps ask that question of the Port of Dover, because I think they were always very clear that there just simply wasn't the physical space to provide for that kind of fast-track arrangement. Right. You would then, of course, have the argument as to whether or not a truckload of British exports were in fact more valuable and should be prioritised over an empty returning foreign truck. That's going to get you into a very difficult set of decisions, isn't it?
And you made the point that once the 300 spaces at Calais are full, would Calais then say that no more ferries could come in until there were enough spaces?
Well, it was our assumption that the ferries would only carry across trucks if they could see that they were going to be able to be discharged off the ferry, because otherwise the ferry is just stuck there. So I'm sure these things will be a natural dialogue between the carriers and the ports. But that's precisely what the impact would be.
And that was based on the experience when Calais was brought to effectively a halt by industrial action in the summer of 2015. The ferries simply stopped running because they couldn't get access to the port, and of course it's unsafe to leave a ferry moored off of Calais in the Straits of Dover.
And obviously, I mean, Calais and French officials, they were very clear they didn't want that to happen. They would be trying to find ways of mitigating that, and were very keen for us to find ways of trying to almost prevent trucks that weren't ready from arriving in France, so we didn't hit that situation. But that's what we were preparing for.
Thank you very much.
Right. On behalf of the committee, can I thank you once again very much for coming. Your evidence has been really helpful and illuminating, and is absolutely to the point given what else is going on today, here and over the next few days. Thank you very much. Order.